All right, welcome back to another deep dive. Today we're jumping into some really interesting, cutting-edge work on making large reasoning models, well, reason better.
That's right. We're looking at a paper called Learning to Reason under Off-Policy Guidance.
And it proposes this new framework, LUFFY.
Exactly, LUFFY. And it tackles a pretty fundamental problem with how we currently train these big models to reason, especially using what's called zero RL.
Right, zero RL. We've seen things like DeepSeek R1 use it successfully, getting models to reason with like rule-based feedback, but the paper argues there's a big limitation.
Yeah, the on-policy constraint. Basically, the model mostly learns from its own outputs, its own attempts at reasoning.
Okay, so let's pause there. On policy, what's the bottleneck? Why is that a problem if we want these models to get, significantly smarter?
Well, think about it. If it only learns from what it generates, it's kind of stuck improving what it already knows how to do. It gets better, sure, but it struggles to discover fundamentally new reasoning strategies that are outside its current abilities.
Ah, okay. So it can polish its existing skills, but not necessarily acquire totally new ones, like hitting a plateau.
Precisely. The paper mentions studies on Lama 3.2 showing exactly that performance hitting a ceiling with zero RL. It sort of amplifies existing behaviors rather than generating truly novel ones.
Got it. So the big question this paper, LUFFY, was trying to answer is, how do we get these models to learn reasoning beyond those initial boundaries?
Exactly. And that's where this off-policy guidance comes in.
Off-policy, meaning learning from data that didn't come from the model's own current strategy.
Yes. Leveraging reasoning traces from other potentially more powerful models. Think of it like learning from an expert's worked examples.
Okay, so for the quick summary up front, LUFFY basically mixes this off-policy data, these expert examples, into the standard zero RL training.
Yeah, but it does it cleverly. It uses something called policy shaping with regularized importance sampling. It's about balancing learning from those expert traces, the imitation part, with allowing the model to keep exploring on its own.
And this leads to better results.
Much better, according to the paper. Significant gains on math reasoning benchmarks, better generalization, even to problems the model hasn't explicitly seen before, compared to just on-policy RL or standard supervised fine-tuning.
Impressive stuff. Okay, let's dive deeper then. You mentioned zero RL's limitations, the on-policy problem. The paper also touches on just using supervised fine-tuning, SFT, basically imitation learning, as an alternative. Why isn't that the perfect solution?
Right. SFT seems like the obvious fix to show the model lots of correct reasoning examples from, say, a stronger model like DeepSeek R1. And it does help. Performance often goes up.
But there's a catch.
There's a catch. Recent research suggests models trained this way can sometimes just learn to mimic the style or superficial patterns of the reasoning without really grasping the underlying logic.
So they look like they're reasoning correctly, but it's brittle. It breaks easily on new problems.
Exactly. They might develop these rigid reasoning patterns that don't generalize well. They become good mimics, but maybe not good independent reasoners.
Okay, so SFT has its limits. And pure on-policy zero RL hits a ceiling. That really sets the stage for needing something different.
And that's LUFFY's entry point. Bringing off-policy learning, which is powerful in other RL areas like robotics, into this specific domain of training large reasoning models. It's been relatively unexplored here.
LUFFY, Learning to Reason, under off-policy guidance.
I like the acronym. So how does it actually work? How does it combine the model's own attempts with these external off-policy examples?
The core idea, shown nicely in Figure 1 of the paper, is to take the model's own generated reasoning attempts, the on-policy rollouts, and mix them with these off-policy reasoning traces, maybe from DeepSeek R1, before calculating the advantage, which guides the learning update.
So it sees both its own tries and the expert tries side by side when deciding what worked best.
Kind of. The intuition is selective imitation. If the model's own attempts are failing to find a correct solution, the signal from the successful off-policy trace gets amplified, encouraging the model to learn from that external example.
But if the model is succeeding on its own, then it preserves that self-driven exploration. It allows the model to keep learning by doing when its own strategies are working. It's aiming for a balance, not just blindly copying.
That sounds smart, but potentially tricky. The paper warns about just naively mixing them, saying it could lead to problems like converging too fast or entropy collapse. What does that mean?
Yeah, that's a critical point. If you just flood the training with off-policy data, the model might latch onto those external examples too quickly and strongly. It stopped exploring diverse strategies itself.
Its own creativity or exploration shuts down.
Exactly. That's the entropy collapse. The variety in its generated reasoning shrinks drastically. It might just learn superficial patterns from the off-policy data instead of the deep structure of the reasoning, like cramming for a test by memorizing answers without understanding the concepts.
Where you want deep understanding, not just surface-level mimicry. So LUFFY needs something to prevent this. That's where the policy shaping via regularized importance sampling comes in. Sounds complicated.
It is a bit technical, but it's really the heart of LUFFY's innovation. Policy shaping, generally, is about guiding the learning. Here, they use regularized importance sampling in a specific way. It essentially boosts the learning signal for actions within those off-policy traces that are crucial for solving the problem, but which the model might currently think are very unlikely or low probability.
So it highlights the non-obvious but correct steps from the expert trace.
Precisely. It tells the model, hey, pay attention to this step, even though it seems weird to you right now, it's important. This encourages the model to keep exploring, to not just dismiss those low probability actions, preventing that premature convergence and entropy collapse we talked about. It leads to deeper, more generalizable reasoning.
The paper points to equation 5 for the loss function and then this shaping function, fx, x loss, xup, with gamma set to 0.1. Can you unpack that function a bit? Why that form?
Okay, so that shaping function, fx, and more importantly, its derivative phic, which appears in equation 6, acts like a dynamic weighting factor. Look at figure 3 in the paper. The middle plot shows the function. Because of its shape, especially with go at 0.1, phi becomes larger when the model's current probability for an action is low.
So it amplifies the gradient, the learning signal, specifically for actions the model currently thinks are improbable.
Exactly. Equation 8 shows this effect on the gradient. It reweights things to give more importance to learning from those low probability, potentially surprising but correct actions found in the off-policy data. It nudges the model to learn the hard steps, not just the easy ones it might already be leaning towards.
Okay, that makes intuitive sense. It's forcing the model to consider the difficult but necessary parts of the expert solution. Now, LUFFY is built on mixed policy GRPO. Let's back up. What's GRPO?
Right. GRPO is grouped relative policy optimization. It's the RL algorithm used successfully in DeepSeek R1. A key difference from something like PPO is how it estimates the advantage how good an action is. Instead of needing a separate value function, GRPO compares the rewards from multiple complete solutions, N samples, generated for the same prompt. Equation 1 shows its objective.
And LUFFY's mixed policy GRPO modifies this.
Yes. Equation 2 shows how. It simply adds the off-policy rollouts, like the one from DeepSeek R1, into that group of N samples when calculating the advantage.
So if the model's own 7 samples all failed, low reward, but the one off-policy sample succeeded, high reward, that successful path gets a huge advantage signal.
Exactly. It naturally guides the learning towards the successful strategies seen in the off-policy data, especially when the model itself is struggling. But crucially, you're mixing data from different policies, the model's current one and the off-policy one.
Which could mess things up. Introduce bias.
It could. So they use importance sampling within mixed policy GRPO. That's equations 3 and 4. This corrects for the fact that the actions in the off-policy trace were generated by a different policy. It calibrates the gradient estimate. It's worth noting this importance sampling is different from the standard on-policy kind that corrects for policy changes between updates.
And there's even a theorem.
Yeah, Theorem One provides some theoretical backing, showing that this importance-weighted estimator converges reasonably well at a rate of 0.1 euro, which is reassuring.
Okay, another seemingly key change LUFFY makes is removing the on-policy clip. Why get rid of that? Clipping is usually there for stability in algorithms like PPO, right?
It is. Clipping creates a sort of trust region, preventing the policy from changing too wildly in one update step, which helps stability.
So why remove it?
Because when you introduce potentially very different but high-quality reasoning from an off-policy source, especially early on, the standard clip can actually prevent the model from learning effectively from that guidance.
The clip might see the off-policy action as too different and just cut off the learning signal.
Precisely. Figure 4 illustrates this. The optimal action suggested by the off-policy trace might be far outside the current policy's comfort zone. Clipping would suppress the update towards that better action. Removing the clip gives the model the flexibility to take those larger steps needed to adopt the superior off-policy strategies.
Makes sense. You need to allow for bigger jumps when you're getting guidance from a much better reasoner. Okay, let's switch gears to the experiments. They used a math dataset, OpenR1 Math, with traces from DeepSeek R1. What were some key setup details?
They filtered it down to about 45K prompts. For the RL part, specific choices, no KL penalty, beta 0, a small entropy bonus, 0.01 to encourage some exploration, and they removed some normalization terms from the standard GRPO loss.
And the LUFFY specific stuff.
The policy shaping gamma was 0.1, as we discussed. Batch sizes were 128 for rollouts, 64 for updates. For each prompt, they sampled 8 reasoning traces. 1 off policy from DeepSeek R1, and 7 on policy from the model being trained. Rollout temperature was 1.0 to get diverse attempts.
What about the model itself?
Primarily Quen 2.5 Math 7B, but they also tested on a smaller 1.5B version and an InstructTune 7B version to show generality. They tweaked context length settings, increased rope theta, used a sliding window likely to handle potentially longer reasoning chains from DeepSeek R1. Learning rate was tiny, 1E6. RL training was just 500 steps, while SFT baselines ran for 3 epochs, used 8 A100 GPUs, and importantly, a consistent system prompt for all runs.
And evaluation looked pretty comprehensive.
Yeah, 6 math benchmarks, AIM 2024, the new AIM 2025, AMC Math 500, Minerva, Olympiad bench, plus out-of-distribution tests like ARCC, GPQA, MMLU Pro to check generalization. They even shuffled multiple choice options. Test temperature was lower, 0.6.
And the reward was simple, just correct final answer or not.
Yep, binary reward. 1 if the final answer matches the ground truth, verified by LUF-FY Equation 9, 0 otherwise. Simple, but effective for math reasoning.
Okay, the moment of truth, the results.
Yeah.
Did LUFY actually outperform the others?
Oh yeah, big time. Looking at Table 1, LUFFY had an average score of 49.6 across those 6 main math benchmarks. That's a solid plus 7.0 points over the existing 0 RL methods they compared against. That's a new state of the art.
Wow, 7 points is huge in these benchmarks.
It really is. And notably, it got a big plus 8.2 point boost on the brand new AE25 benchmark, which is a great sign for generalization to totally unseen problems.
How did it compare to their own baselines, the On-Policy RL and SFT they ran?
Also strong improvements. It beat their On-Policy RL replication by plus 4.8 points on average, and it beat their SFT baseline by plus 2.0 points on average. This suggests it's not just better than prior 0 RL, but also a better way to distill knowledge from a strong model like DeepSeek R1 compared to just doing SFT.
Okay, impressive on the main tasks. What about generalization to those out-of-distribution benchmarks? That's often where methods fall down.
LUFFY held up really well there too, according to Table 2. It showed considerable gains over the previous 0 RL results. It was competitive with their On-Policy RL, but significantly outperformed SFT, which, as expected, struggled more when moving to different domains like ARC or MMLU Pro.
So SFT learns the style for one domain, but LUFFY learns a more robust reasoning ability.
That seems to be the implication. They also highlight that LUFFY achieved better results than the base Quen 2.5 Math 7B Instruct model, even though LUFFY used less data and compute for its training phase. That's quite efficient.
Very cool. The paper also dives into training dynamics with figure 5 rewards, generation length, entropy. What did those graphs show?
They're quite insightful. The reward plot left shows LUFFY takes an initial small dip as it adjusts to the off-policy guidance, but then it steadily pulls ahead of the on-policy RL baseline.
And generation length.
The middle plot shows LUFFY's generations start out a bit longer, likely influenced by the DeepSeek R1 traces, but then it actually becomes more concise over training, finding shorter paths.
Interesting. And entropy. That relates to exploration.
Right, the entropy plot, right, is maybe the most telling. LUFFY maintains significantly higher entropy throughout training compared to on-policy RL, where entropy collapses quite quickly.
Meaning LUFFY keeps exploring more diverse reasoning paths.
Exactly. It doesn't just converge onto one narrow strategy, it keeps exploring, which is likely key to finding better, more general solutions. The fluctuations suggest it's actively trying out those low probability but potentially crucial actions we discussed earlier.
That sustained exploration seems critical. The Ablation Study, Table 3, Figure 6, must be important too, breaking down LUFFY's components.
Absolutely. Table 3 confirms that both the policy shaping and removing the on-policy clip do contribute positively when used with the mixed policy training, i.e. with the off-policy data.
But what if you use shaping or remove the clip without the off-policy data?
That's the key control experiment. They found those enhancements alone don't really help the standard on-policy RL. It really highlights that you need the signal from the external off-policy guidance for these mechanisms to be effective. The guidance provides the direction, and shaping no clip help the model follow it effectively.
And figure 6, tracking performance over time.
It shows that just mixing policies gives a quick boost but then plateaus. Adding policy shaping avoids that plateau and leads to better final performance. Removing the clip seems to provide a further lift, especially later in training. All components work together.
And they confirmed this wasn't just a fluke with the Quen 7b model. They tested others.
Yep, Table 4 shows results on Quen 2.5, Math 1.5b, and Quen 2.5 Instruct 7b. The pattern holds. LUF-FY consistently provides substantial gains over both SFT and on-policy RL on these different models too.
Okay, so the results look solid. The analysis section tries to explain why it works so well. They looked at BLEU scores for similarity.
Right. The BLEU scores compared to the DeepSeek-R1 traces were interesting. SFT had a high score, 57.5, meaning it copied a lot. On-policy RL had a very low score, 8.8, as expected. LUF-FY was in the middle, 44.8.
Suggesting it imitates, but selectively, not just blind copying.
Exactly. It learns from DeepSeek-R1, but doesn't just replicate it wholesale.
And the generation length analysis in Figure 7, you mentioned LUF-FY finds shorter solutions.
Yes, when LUF-FY gets the answer right, its reasoning trace is significantly shorter, on average, than SFT's correct traces, like 2,800 tokens versus over 4,600. And interestingly, SFT's incorrect solutions were often extremely long, suggesting it might be rambling or stuck in unproductive loops learned from the expert style. LUF-FY seems to learn more efficient reasoning.
That's a good sign of actual understanding versus just pattern matching. And finally, Figure 8 looked at test time exploration using temperature.
Yeah, this one's cool. They varied the sampling temperature at test time. For LUF-FY and on-policy RL, performance actually improved slightly with higher temperature, meaning more exploration at test time helped find correct answers.
But not for SFT.
For SFT, performance dropped as temperature increased. This suggests SFT relies heavily on the specific, memorized patterns it learned. When you introduce more randomness via temperature, those fragile patterns break down. LUF-FY and on-policy RL seem to have learned more robust, generalizable reasoning strategies that can actually benefit from exploring different paths.
Fascinating. So LUF-FY learns reasoning that is not only effective, but also more robust and exploratory. The paper briefly mentions related work, other RL approaches for reasoning.
It does. It situates LUF-FY relative to things like DeepSeek-R1 itself, OpenAI's O1, Kimi, Bolt, Lama, etc. It argues LUF-FY strikes a unique balance. Pure RL methods can struggle with sample efficiency and exploration, while pure SFT struggles with generalization. LUF-FY aims to get the best of both worlds by using the off-policy data to make the on-policy learning more efficient and effective, while the policy shaping maintains stability and exploration.
So wrapping up, LUF-FY really does seem like a novel and effective approach. The key takeaway is this clever blend of learning from expert examples, off-policy, while still encouraging the model's own exploration on policy.
I think that's exactly it. LUF-FY integrates that off-policy guidance into zero RL, using mixed policy updates and that crucial policy shaping mechanism. The results, SOTA on math benchmarks, strong O generalization, really speak for themselves. It's this balance between imitation and exploration that seems key.
And it points towards potentially more scalable ways to build these really powerful reasoning models, maybe moving beyond just scaling data and parameters.
Definitely. Leveraging high-quality external data like expert reasoning traces seems like a very promising direction. The paper suggests future work like extending LUF-FY to other areas beyond math or even other modalities and refining the policy shaping itself.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If we can effectively guide models with expert reasoning, what other kinds of guidance could we use? Could we use critiques or maybe structured knowledge? It opens up a lot of possibilities for how we train these systems.
Absolutely. It's a fundamental shift, potentially, moving from purely self-supervised or rule-based learning towards more guided, knowledge-infused training paradigms. Exciting times.
Well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive into LUF-FY, a fascinating paper. We hope you found this useful. We'll drop a link to the paper in the description, of course. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks, everyone.
We'll catch you on the next deep dive.